I swear I only turned my back for a second. And just like that, 20 years of roots, shade, and bird songs were gone, flattened in a single morning so the HOA could cram in 150 soulless boxes wrapped in fake stone panels with zero charm, zero warmth, zero life. I'm not saying I believe in karma, but what happened next sure felt like something in the universe was keeping score, and if you've ever watched a landscaping decision spiral into a full-blown disaster, you'll understand why I can't let it go. For 20 years, I poured every bit of myself into transforming a barren, rocky plot of land into what I can only describe as a green paradise. When I first moved in, the soil was hard and dry, nothing but stubborn patches of crabgrass, weeds, and stones that seemed determined to slice open every shovel I owned. My neighbors thought I was crazy, spending every spare weekend kneeling in the dirt, pulling weeds, hauling in wheelbarrows of compost and mulch. But I saw what it could become. Every morning, I woke to birdsong echoing through branches I'd watched grow from fragile saplings, trembling in the spring winds but surviving, stretching taller year after year. Every evening, I would walk among the trees and flowers, watering under the last glow of sunset, listening to the leaves rustle like whispers of gratitude for every drop I gave them. It was more than a garden to me. It was my refuge, my sanctuary, the living embodiment of years of patience and hope. I didn't just plant trees, I raised them like family, knowing each curve in their trunks, each scar from a rough winter or a storm, each burst of green every spring. I think that's why I'm getting emotional even now, telling this story. Because when you put that much of your heart into something, it becomes part of you. You can't just watch it be destroyed without feeling like something inside you is being ripped apart too. Then came Victoria Sterling. I still remember the first time I saw her, gliding into the community meeting like a suburban tornado wrapped in a perfectly pressed blazer. Her blonde hair was styled into a shellacked helmet, every strand in place like she was afraid of letting the world see her as anything less than perfect. Her smile was so bright and so fake it might as well have been painted on. She stood at the front of the room, cleared her throat with a dainty, theatrical cough, and began her speech with the self-satisfied tone of someone who'd practiced it 100 times in the mirror. Ladies and gentlemen, I am thrilled to share that 150 modern homes will transform this outdated area into a model neighborhood that will be the envy of the entire county. I felt my stomach drop before she even finished. The words transform and outdated always mean the same thing, destruction disguised as progress. I raised my hand slowly, already knowing I wasn't going to like the answer to the question clawing at my insides. "Excuse me, Victoria," I said, keeping my voice calm even though I could feel my pulse hammering in my neck. "What exactly happens to the old trees? Some of them have been growing here for decades." The room fell silent, the kind of silence that feels heavy, like everyone's holding their breath. Victoria's smile widened, her eyes glittering like glass as she flipped her hair back with a flick that made my skin crawl. "Oh, we'll be improving the landscaping, of course," she said, voice dripping with condescension. "Smaller trees will be prettier and easier to maintain. These big old trees are outdated." The way she said outdated while looking directly at me, I knew right then that Victoria Sterling and I were going to have problems. I didn't know yet just how far she would go to get what she wanted, but looking back, I should have known. Anyone who could dismiss decades of careful growth and living beauty as outdated landscaping wasn't going to listen to reason. That night, I couldn't sleep. I stood at my window for hours, staring out at the trees under the moonlight, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. I tried to convince myself that maybe Victoria was telling the truth, that maybe they really would just trim a few branches and leave the rest alone. Maybe I was overreacting. God, if I could go back, I would shake myself until I snapped out of it. The next morning, I woke up to a sound that I swear will haunt me for the rest of my life. Chainsaws. Dozens of them roaring like a death choir outside my window. I jumped out of bed, throwing on the first clothes I could find, not even bothering with shoes, running out the door with bare feet slipping on the dewy grass. When I reached the edge of my property, I stopped, frozen, unable to comprehend what I was seeing. Trees I had planted with my own hands, trees that had survived storms and droughts, trees that had shaded me on hot days and filled the air with the scent of blossoms in spring, were being cut down, one by one, crashing to the ground like thunderclaps. The noise wasn't just mechanical. It was like listening to the forest itself screaming in pain. And there she was, Victoria Sterling, standing in the middle of it all with her arms crossed, wearing designer sunglasses that probably cost more than most people's rent. She looked like she was directing a photo shoot, not the destruction of a living landscape. When she saw me, she actually waved, like we were old friends meeting for brunch. "You're killing them." I screamed over the roar of the chainsaws, my voice hoarse, tears streaming down my face. These trees have been growing here for decades. She didn't even flinch. She just shrugged and said, I'm improving property values. You should be thanking me. These old trees were just taking up valuable space. I stood there, powerless, as the last of my oaks fell, watching it crash to the ground in a cloud of sawdust, feeling like I was witnessing the murder of a loved one. In the distance, I saw Agnes McCall, my elderly neighbor, standing at her fence, shaking her head slowly. Her eyes met mine, and there was something in them, a kind of knowing sadness that told me she had seen this before. When the last chainsaw finally went silent, an eerie quiet settled over the empty lot. I stood there, the smell of sap and fresh wood heavy in the air, looking at the stumps and the piles of branches, feeling like the ground itself was mourning. But beneath the grief, I felt something else. A spark of anger, of determination. I wasn't going to let Victoria Sterling get away with this. I went home that day and pulled out the HOA handbook. 200 pages of mind-numbing rules about paint colors, lawn heights, mailbox placement, and hedge trimming. Most of it was bureaucratic nonsense, but I read every single word, looking for anything I could use. Buried deep in the fine print were phrases like landscape improvements for community benefit and aesthetic enhancement projects. The language was so vague it could mean anything, or everything. And I realized that Victoria's power came from these ambiguities, from rules that were designed to be twisted by those who knew how. But it wasn't enough to find loopholes in the rules. I needed to know who I was really dealing with if I was going to stand a chance. So I went to see Agnes McCall. Agnes had lived in the neighborhood longer than anyone else, and the look in her eyes that day told me she knew things that might help me understand the enemy I was facing. I found her in her yard, tending to a small garden of flowers and herbs, her movements slow but precise. When I approached and asked if we could talk, she looked up with sharp blue eyes that seemed to pierce right through me. You want to know about Victoria Sterling? She asked, her voice calm but carrying a weight that made me pause. Well, you'd better come sit on the porch and have some tea. This isn't a short story. She led me to her porch, poured tea from a chipped pot that looked like it had seen 100 years of stories, and sat down across from me. Victoria Sterling, Agnes began, her eyes narrowing slightly, is the kind of person who will smile in your face while she's sticking a knife in your back. She's been here for 5 years, but it feels like 50. The minute she got on the HOA board, she started making changes. Small at first. She made me repaint my house from white to cream because it didn't match her aesthetic vision. She told the Johnsons they had to remove their wind chimes because they were disruptive. She fined the Garcias for having a vegetable garden in their front yard. Agnes took a sip of her tea, her hands shaking slightly, but her voice remained steady. She has this way of making you feel like you're the one being unreasonable. Like she's doing you a favor by taking away the things you love. I listened, taking it all in, the anger inside me solidifying into something cold and focused. Because I realized then that Victoria Sterling wasn't just a petty tyrant with a taste for control, she was a professional at it. I didn't know yet how I was going to fight back. But I knew I had to. For the trees. For the neighbors she had bullied into silence. And for every bit of green that still fought to survive in a world that valued profit over life. Because sometimes, even when you think you're powerless, you have to stand up and fight anyway. 30 years. 30 years of living in this neighborhood, raising a family here, watching trees grow from saplings to towering protectors of my home, watching the seasons change through those branches, and suddenly, according to Victoria Sterling, I was non-compliant. Agnes paused to sip her tea, her gnarled fingers gripping the cup like it was the last warm thing she had. The steam curled up around her lined face, and I could see in her eyes that the memory still stung, even after all these years. You could tell it wasn't just an old woman's bitterness, it was the quiet pain of someone who had been violated in her own sanctuary. I refused at first, she said, setting the cup down with a soft clink that sounded loud in the quiet of her kitchen. Obviously, this was my home, Ethan. I'd been living here since before Victoria Sterling even knew this neighborhood existed. She was probably still in college, learning how to smile that fake smile, when I was planting the roses out front. Her voice grew distant, as if she was seeing those moments replay behind her eyes. The porch repainting, the letters from the HOA, the calls from Victoria's office telling her she had 30 days to comply, the threats of fines. She didn't give up, you know. Fined me, threatened me, made my life miserable for months. Agnes' mouth twitched like she was tasting something sour. She thought she could break me. She didn't. Agnes' eyes lit up, and for the first time since I'd known her, I saw a genuine smile on her face, not the polite, tired one she usually wore for neighbors, but a flash of fire, a glimpse of the woman who had fought back and won. "I had enough," she said, sitting up straighter. "I decided to fight back legally. Hired a lawyer and sued her for harassment and exceeding her authority as HOA president." I leaned forward, hanging on every word. "What happened?" "I won that case, by the way," Agnes said, a laugh slipping through, bright and sharp. "The judge ruled that Victoria had no legal right to force me to change my house color based on her personal preferences. She lost, and she lost big." The judge's face when he read out the ruling, "God, I wish I had a picture." Agnes leaned forward, her eyes bright and piercing. "But here's the thing you need to understand about Victoria Sterling, Ethan. She never forgets when someone challenges her authority, and she never forgives anyone who makes her look bad in public. That woman holds grudges like it's her full-time job." She stood up then, her joints cracking, and walked slowly toward an old wooden cabinet near the far wall of her kitchen. She opened it and rummaged around, pushing aside old books, a small stack of yellowing papers, and what looked like a dusty porcelain cat. She pulled out a banker's box that looked like it had survived a flood or two, corners frayed, the cardboard dented and stained. When she set it down on the table in front of me, I felt a strange heaviness in the air, like the moment you know you're about to learn something you can never know. "Open it," she said. Inside that box was a treasure trove of information that made my head spin. Receipts, emails, handwritten notes, board meeting minutes, financial ledgers, contractor agreements, safety reports, photos, copies of letters from residents, 5 years' worth of the skeletons Victoria Sterling had left scattered around this neighborhood while she wore her plastic smile and pretended she was helping us all. There were contractor agreements that were so vague about safety standards and building codes it was like they were written by a child, or by someone who wanted to leave just enough wiggle room to ignore them. Emails between Victoria and board members discussing how to handle residents who protested her decisions, calling them problematic elements that needed to be corrected or quieted. Safety reports with entire sections crossed out in pen, replaced with handwritten notes that reduced severe hazard to manageable concern. Financial documents showing large payments to contractors who weren't even licensed for the work they were doing, all hidden behind the HOA's bland official stationery. It was like looking at a roadmap of corruption, negligence, and cruelty that stretched back years, a dirty river that had been flowing through this community while people like me were busy watering their gardens, paying their dues, trying to live peacefully. "Victoria Sterling isn't a community leader," Agnes said, watching me flip through the documents with growing disbelief and horror. "She's a control freak with an official title who treats this neighborhood like her personal kingdom. And she surrounds herself with people who are either too scared to question her or too invested in her scams to care." She pulled out a single email, its subject line so ordinary, cost analysis, but what was inside made my blood run cold. It was Victoria Sterling casually discussing with a contractor ways to cut corners on a foundation project, suggesting cheaper materials and ignoring soil stabilization requirements to speed up timelines and reduce unnecessary costs. "Unnecessary costs," she said, her voice shaking with anger. "Like safety. Like the stability of the ground our homes sit on." I sat there, reading document after document, seeing the bigger picture. The trees were just the latest casualties in a long war Victoria Sterling was waging against anything that didn't align with her desire for control and profit. She didn't see people, trees, or homes, she saw obstacles or stepping stones. "Now you know what you're really dealing with," Agnes said, her voice softer, sadder. "The question is, what are you going to do about it?" I didn't answer immediately. I sat there for a long time, the documents spread out in front of me like a map of the battlefield. I saw how she used power, how she silenced people, how she made resistance seem futile. But the anger burning in my chest felt like a call to action. I carefully gathered the most damaging documents, copied them using Agnes' dusty old scanner, and tucked them under my arm. I thanked Agnes for trusting me, for giving me something real to fight with, and walked home under a sky that felt strangely heavy, like it was pressing down, urging me forward. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed up drafting a letter to the HOA board, not an angry rant, but a precise, detailed document citing regulations, violations, specific financial misconduct, safety violations, and evidence that would force them to acknowledge what was happening. For the first time, I felt like I was fighting smart, not just fighting mad. The next morning, I mailed the letter, my hands shaking a little as I slid it into the slot, the thud it made echoing in my ears like a promise. A week later, I received a reply from Clara Monroe, the HOA secretary, in the driest, most dismissive bureaucratic language possible. "Dear Mr. Vance, Thank you for your recent correspondence regarding the Meadowbrook development project. Please be assured that this project fully complies with all local and state regulations. All resident concerns have been thoroughly reviewed by qualified professionals and addressed appropriately. We appreciate your continued interest in community affairs. Word for word, a boilerplate dismissal. I wrote back, this time even more detailed, citing exact sections of the HOA bylaws and attaching copies of the financial documents Agnes had provided, with annotations and highlights. I mailed it with the same shaking hands, but this time I felt a surge of satisfaction. A week later, I received the exact same email. Word for word. It was as if they had a macro to generate these replies, as if they didn't even read my letter. As if they thought I was just another problematic element to be ignored until I gave up. I was preparing a third, even more aggressive letter, strategizing a push for a community meeting, when something happened that nobody could have predicted. Mother Nature decided to weigh in. It was a sunny afternoon, the kind where the sky is so blue it almost hurts your eyes. I was sitting at my kitchen table, staring out at the construction site that had once been my garden, watching the workers move dirt like ants. Then I noticed the clouds rolling in from the west, thick and dark, moving far faster than seemed natural. The sky turned an eerie gray-black, swallowing the sun, making the neighborhood look like a photograph in negative. The wind picked up, rattling the windows, making the old oaks that survived outside groan and sway. Then the rain came. Not a drizzle, not even a heavy shower. It was a wall of water, a relentless sheet pounding the earth with a force that felt biblical. Thunder cracked so loud it rattled the dishes in my cupboards. Lightning split the sky in jagged forks, lighting up the black clouds like some angry god was tearing them open. And then I saw it, the water, pouring into the foundation holes they dug for Victoria's new houses, turning carefully leveled dirt into a swamp. Without the trees and their deep roots, there was nothing to hold the soil in place. Decades of stability ripped out for profit, leaving the earth vulnerable. Within 30 minutes, the construction site had turned into a series of muddy lakes, water pooling in the foundation trenches, swallowing rebar, flooding the half-finished plumbing lines. Heavy machinery that had been so confidently parked started to sink, wheels disappearing into mud like they were toys left out in the rain. A backhoe listed dangerously to one side, and I saw the operator jump clear as it tipped, sinking deeper until only the cab was visible above the slurry. I grabbed my phone and started recording, capturing every moment, every splash of muddy water, every piece of machinery sinking beneath the earth. I knew instinctively that this footage was going to be important. Then Victoria Sterling arrived. Seeing her drenched, her hair plastered to her face, mud splattered across her expensive coat, screaming into her phone, was almost worth the weeks of stress she'd caused me. She was yelling orders, trying to coordinate an impossible rescue of equipment and progress that was now washing away before her eyes. And then I saw Clara Monroe, standing under a dripping umbrella, her eyes scanning the chaos. She wasn't panicking like the others. She wasn't running around screaming orders or trying to save sinking equipment. She was watching. And every so often, her eyes would drift over to my house, to where I stood recording, and there was something in her look I couldn't quite read. Not fear, not loyalty to Victoria. Something else. Something like the realization that the ground was shifting beneath all of us, and maybe it was time to pick a side. And as thunder rolled overhead and the rain continued to pour, I realized that the real storm had just begun. The rain finally stopped after about an hour, but by the time the last drops fell, the damage was undeniable. From my kitchen window, I could see the wreckage of Victoria Sterling's so-called jewel of the county reduced to something that looked like a forgotten battlefield from a war no one had bothered to finish. The fancy banners promising modern luxury living flapped limply in the soggy wind, half torn free of their posts. Heavy machinery, backhoes, mixers, forklifts, sat stranded at unnatural angles, half swallowed by the angry new lakes that had formed overnight. Foundation trenches meant to hold dreams of pristine suburban bliss were now brimming with brown water so thick it looked like chocolate pudding. Rumor got around fast. Someone on the crew told someone's cousin who told someone at the coffee shop that the damage would cost at least 50 grand to clean up and push them back by at least a month. Maybe more if the next rain came early. And it would. This town knew rain. It always came when you least wanted it. I watched all of it unfold from the same spot I'd once stood watering my rose bushes every morning. A different life. I could see Victoria Sterling in the distance. Her bright blazer looked so out of place splattered with mud. She was pacing back and forth, phone pressed to her ear, waving her free hand at the foreman like her fury alone could dry up the water and reset the clock. But there was nothing she could do except shout into her phone and pretend she still had control. And I felt it, a dark, guilty satisfaction bubbling up in my chest. I'm not a vengeful man by nature, but watching Victoria Sterling sink ankle-deep in the very mud she'd created felt like the universe had turned the tables, if only for a second. I told myself it was petty to feel glad, but if you'd spent years watching the same trees grow, if you'd spent mornings breathing in the peace they gave you, you'd know this wasn't petty. It was justice. Or maybe just the beginning of it. But beneath that satisfaction was a tugging worry I couldn't shake. The storm had given me a taste of Victoria's plans unraveling, but a part of me knew better than to think she'd back down now. She was rattled, yes, I'd seen it, the way her mask slipped when the foreman told her they'd have to drain the trenches and check the soil before work could continue. Her expression said it all. The future she'd built in her head was suddenly sliding away from her, sucked down into the same mud that was swallowing her project. But that woman wasn't the type to cut her losses. No, she'd double down. And the next time, she'd make sure no storm or nosy neighbor could get in her way. That thought made my satisfaction taste sour. I needed more than the storm if I was going to fight her for Real. Something stronger than my righteous anger. I needed knowledge. Hard facts. The kind you couldn't brush aside with a form letter from the HOA. The kind of truth that didn't bend to spin or smiles or threats. That's when I thought of Dr. Aries Thorne. He'd moved in about 6 months ago, buying the old Whitaker place at the corner lot. People said he was a retired professor or an engineer, maybe both, depending on who you asked at the neighborhood potluck. I'd seen him plenty of mornings since the construction began, leaning against his fence, arms folded, watching the site like a man watching a slow train wreck. But unlike everyone else, he didn't just gawk, he took notes. Tiny scribbles on a small leather pad he carried in his coat pocket like an old-fashioned reporter. I'd catch him sometimes, shaking his head, eyes narrowed at the site like he was silently calculating something no one else could see. So the next morning, when the clouds finally cleared and the crew was out there ankle-deep in muck trying to salvage half-buried machines, I made up my mind. I crossed the street with my heart hammering stupidly in my chest like I was about to ask someone on a date instead of recruiting them for what could become a neighborhood war. I found Dr. Thorne exactly where I expected him, leaning over his front gate, notepad in hand, eyes flicking between the sunken foundations and the heavy pump truck struggling to drain the lakes that weren't supposed to exist. "Excuse me," I called out, trying to sound casual, though I was aware I probably sounded like I was about to pitch a conspiracy theory. His eyes snapped up, gray and sharp behind his glasses. He didn't smile but he didn't frown either, just waited. "We haven't really talked properly," I said, pushing my hands into my jacket pockets so he wouldn't see them trembling. "I'm Ethan Vance. I live across the street." I jerked my chin at the mess behind me. "I couldn't help but notice you seem interested in what's happening over there." He arched an eyebrow. I could see the flicker of caution behind his eyes. He was probably wondering if I was about to drag him into the neighborhood drama everyone pretended didn't exist. Finally, he closed his notepad with a soft snap. "I'm retired," he said, voice careful but kind. "Used to be a geological engineer. 35 years. He shrugged like he was telling me something trivial, but it felt huge. A piece of the puzzle falling into my lap. "You see something wrong?" I asked. He didn't answer immediately. He turned his head, studying the waterlogged site. When he spoke, his voice was low and even, but every word felt like a nail in the coffin of Victoria's project. "The way they're digging? The soil they're disturbing? It's all wrong. That storm didn't do this alone. They set themselves up for failure." He paused, like he was debating whether to say more. Then his eyes flicked to mine, weighing me, deciding if I was worth the trouble. I must have passed whatever test he was giving me because he let out a breath and said, "It's not good, Mr. Vance. Not good at all." He said it like an engineer says it, like not good really meant catastrophic. My stomach turned to lead. I didn't want to lose him in polite small talk, so I took a gamble. "Can I buy you a cup of coffee? I'd love to hear exactly how not good this is." Something in him softened then. He glanced at his notepad, then back at me, and nodded once. "All right. Let's talk." Back at my kitchen table, we sat with 2 steaming mugs between us. I pulled out the old soil map Agnes had helped me find at the county records office. It was old, yellowed at the edges, creased from being folded too many times, but it was the best piece of real evidence I had. Dr. Thorne spread it out carefully, pulling a pair of slim reading glasses from his coat pocket. His hands moved slowly, respectfully, like a priest opening a holy book. For a long time, the only sound in my kitchen was the ticking of the clock on the wall and the distant drone of the pump trucks trying to bail out Victoria's dream. I watched him trace the lines with one blunt fingertip, back and forth, his brow furrowing deeper with every pass. Now and then, he'd mumble something under his breath, numbers, geological terms I didn't understand. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, but the fear in it made my skin crawl. "Oh, no," he murmured. He tapped the section of the map that covered the exact spot where Victoria's modern homes were supposed to rise like trophies of progress. "Clay. All clay here. A shallow layer too. You tear out the root systems? It loses cohesion. Wet clay shifts. Dry clay cracks. It's unstable by nature, always hungry to move." His eyes lifted to mine, and for the first time, I saw raw, professional dread there. "Do you understand what that means, Ethan?" I swallowed, my throat dry. I thought I did, but I needed to hear him say it so it would feel real, so it wouldn't be just my imagination spinning worst-case scenarios. "Tell me," I said. He leaned back and folded his hands on the map. "It means if we get another storm like yesterday, just one more big rain, those 150 houses they're planning to build could literally sink. Not just water in basements. Total subsidence. Foundations failing. Walls cracking. Pipes snapping like twigs. The ground can't bear that load without the tree's roots stabilizing it. They stripped the only thing keeping that soil in place." I felt the blood drain from my face. It hit me in a cold wave. This wasn't just about my trees anymore. This was people's homes, their families, their kids sleeping above a ticking geological bomb. It could be dozens, maybe hundreds of families living in houses that might buckle if nature decided to test Victoria Sterling's arrogance one more time. I leaned forward, voice hoarse. "Are you sure?" Dr. Thorne pulled out his phone and slid it across the table. Photo after photo, foundation holes brimming with water that refused to drain, cracks spiderwebbing through the exposed soil, machines half sunken into what looked more like quicksand than earth. "Look at these trenches," he said, tapping each image as he explained. "Clay soil, when saturated, becomes impermeable. Water can't pass through it easily. It just sits, turning the ground into a sponge that won't dry. And the heavy machinery compacting it while wet? They're making it worse. Once they pour those foundations, any major shift and you'll see entire sections buckle. There's no safe fix for that without massive reinforcements, millions of dollars they won't spend." I sat back, my pulse pounding so hard I could feel it in my fingertips. I looked at him and asked the question I already knew the answer to. "Would you help me prove this? Document it, show the board, the county, anyone who'd listen?" Dr. Thorne was quiet for a long time. He drummed his fingers on the table, staring at the soil map as if it might whisper a different answer if he looked at it long enough. I could see the battle behind his eyes, a lifetime of professional ethics telling him to speak up, his gut telling him to stay out of neighborhood fights he didn't start. Finally, he looked at me with an exhausted, resigned expression. "If I stay silent and something happens, I'd never forgive myself. So yes, I'll help you. But you need to understand something, Ethan. Once we do this, once we poke that hornet's nest, she won't fight fair. She'll come for you, me, maybe anyone we care about." I met his gaze and gave him the only answer I could. "Good. Let her try. This time, we're ready." And as we sat together in my kitchen, surrounded by coffee mugs, old maps, and a growing stack of damning evidence, I knew the storm hadn't ended. It had only just begun. As Dr. Thorne gathered up his photos and prepared to leave, he paused in my doorway, turning back with a look that made the air feel heavier around us. His eyes, sharp and tired at once, locked on mine, and for a moment, the hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the old clock on my wall felt painfully loud. "Just remember, Ethan," he said, his voice low but carrying a gravity that silenced the room, "we're about to challenge someone who's used to getting her way. She has connections, resources, and a reputation to protect. If she decides we're a threat to that, she won't hesitate to make our lives very difficult." I nodded, swallowing against the sudden dryness in my throat. I understood what he was saying, but there was no going back now. Staying silent felt like standing by and letting her gamble with people's safety, including the safety of families who would one day live in homes that might collapse under the wrong rainstorm. I couldn't unsee what we'd uncovered, couldn't pretend it was someone else's problem. But a part of me wondered if I had it in me to face what was coming. The way Dr. Thorne looked at me, I knew he wondered too. Underscore 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 underscore. Victoria called a community meeting the following week to control the narrative. She sent out glossy flyers tucked into mailboxes, decorated with photos of happy families in bright new homes, promising transparent community updates and clarity on recent weather setbacks. It was spin, carefully worded, meant to soothe the residents who had already put down deposits and calm the worried whispers circulating around the neighborhood. The meeting was held in the old community center with its creaky folding chairs and the scent of stale coffee that never quite left the building no matter how many air fresheners they plugged into the walls. When I arrived, the parking lot was already packed, and people were standing in small clusters, talking in low voices, clutching papers, contracts, and coffee cups as if they were shields. Inside, Victoria Sterling had transformed the place into her stage. She stood at the front, poised and polished, wearing a navy blue pantsuit that looked like it cost more than the monthly mortgage payments many of these families would be making. Her hair was pulled back in a sleek bun, makeup immaculate, not a line out of place. A stack of official-looking documents sat neatly in front of her, and beside them, a glass of water she hadn't touched, like even her hydration was too controlled to risk appearing human. She wore a smile that was meant to comfort but only managed to chill me with its hollowness. "Dear residents," she began, her voice carrying across the hushed room with practiced confidence, "I want to address the concerns some of you may have about last week's unfortunate weather incident." Unfortunate weather incident. She said it like the storm was a small hiccup, nothing more than an inconvenience that had slightly delayed her plans, nothing to see, nothing to worry about. She went on, each sentence carefully crafted to sound reassuring, each word another thread in the web she was spinning. "We have comprehensive solutions in place, including deeper foundation systems and enhanced drainage infrastructure. I have personally overseen every detail of our response plan, and I can guarantee that your investments are completely safe." The way she said personally overseen made it sound as if she'd been out there in the mud and rain, working alongside the laborers, when I knew she'd been screaming into her phone from the sidelines, her designer boots never touching the dirt. A man I didn't recognize raised his hand, his voice trembling slightly as he spoke. "I've already put down $20,000 on one of these houses. Can you absolutely guarantee that my family will be safe living there?" Victoria's smile widened, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. She leaned forward slightly, the movement deliberate, intimate, meant to draw the man in. "Sir, your house will be completely safe," she said, her tone dripping with the kind of polished reassurance that politicians use when they want to sound like they care. "We're using the most advanced construction technology available, and we have the full backing of certified engineers and contractors. Trust me when I say that I know exactly what I'm doing." People around the room nodded, some visibly relaxing, wanting so badly to believe her, to have their fears soothed. I saw couples glance at each other, trying to convince themselves that everything was fine, that the rumors were just overblown paranoia. I felt the anger rising in me, burning hot beneath my ribs. I wanted to shout, to tell them what was really happening, but I waited, clutching the folder under my arm so tightly my knuckles turned white. I had to do this right, or she would shut me down before I got a word out. When it was finally my turn to speak, I stood up slowly, feeling every eye in the room turn toward me. My heart hammered so hard I thought it might break through my chest, but I forced myself to meet her gaze across the room. She looked at me like I was an insect buzzing in her ear, a nuisance she would swat away at the earliest convenience. "What about the soil?" I asked, my voice louder than I intended, echoing off the old wood-paneled walls. "You removed the trees that stabilized the land. That soil's not stable anymore." A ripple of uncertainty passed through the crowd, but Victoria's expression didn't falter. "That's a misunderstanding," she began, but before she could finish, Dr. Thorne stepped forward, clearing his throat. His presence was quiet but commanding, the room silencing almost immediately. 35 years in soil engineering," he said, his voice clear, steady, no room for doubt. "That site cannot safely hold the weight of those homes, not after the rain. Not with the root systems gone." The silence that followed was suffocating. Victoria's confident expression flickered, just for a heartbeat, like a mask slipping, before she forced it back into place. I opened the folder in my hands, pulling out the printed emails Agnes had entrusted to me. I held them up for the room to see, the pages shaking only slightly in my grasp. I didn't want to read them out loud, but I had to. These people deserved to know. "You knew the risks," I said, my voice growing stronger with each word. "I have emails here that show you ignored the warnings, that you were told by your own engineers that the land couldn't handle this development without significant additional work, but you chose to move forward anyway." Victoria's eyes went wide, and for the first time, I saw real fear there. I began to read, my voice echoing as the words filled the room. The cost to implement proper foundation safety measures is approximately $2 million. I have decided to proceed with the original specifications to ensure project profitability remains on target. Customers don't need to be burdened with technical details they wouldn't understand anyway. The words hung in the air like smoke, thick and choking, as the room erupted. People shouted, voices layering over each other in a rising tide of fear and anger. A woman near the front clutched her husband's arm, her face pale. Someone yelled, "You lied to us." Another voice shouted, "We trusted you." A man demanded to know if they would get their deposits back. Another said he was calling his lawyer immediately. Victoria tried to speak, her voice cutting through the chaos, but the confidence was gone, replaced by a brittle edge that made her sound desperate. "This is a misunderstanding," she insisted. "These emails are being taken out of context. I would never put anyone's safety at risk for financial gain." But no one was listening to her anymore. The trust that had shielded her for years was gone, shattered in a single moment as her own words were thrown back at her. People were pulling out their phones, calling family, lawyers, news outlets. I saw a man near the back recording everything, and for once, I was grateful for the ever-present cameras. Victoria's face drained of color as she tried to shout over the noise, her eyes scanning the room as if looking for someone to save her, someone to restore the order she'd lost. But there was no one. She had ruled this community with charm and fear, and now both were failing her. In the chaos, her eyes found mine, locking on with a cold, focused intensity that made the hair on my neck stand up. She didn't look angry. She looked calculating, and in that moment, I knew I had just become her next target. Underscore 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 underscore. The next morning, my mailbox held a thick envelope, heavier than it should have been, with my name printed across it in precise, impersonal letters. My stomach sank as I tore it open, pulling out page after page of legal threats and demands. A cease and desist letter. They accused me of spreading false and defamatory information, of interfering with legitimate business operations. They threatened to sue for damages, for slander, for reckless endangerment of community harmony. That same afternoon, there was a knock at my door. 2 uniformed police officers stood on my porch, their faces carefully neutral, their eyes tired. "Mr. Vance," one of them said, "we've received a complaint that you've been harassing a community board member and making threats against a legitimate development project. We need to ask you some questions about your recent interactions with Ms. Victoria Sterling." As they stepped into my home, the weight of what I had started settled on me fully. I had pulled the pin, and the grenade had gone off. But as fear twisted in my gut, another emotion rose up alongside it, stronger, steadier. Resolve. Victoria Sterling wasn't done, but neither was I. This was no longer just about trees or soil. This was about truth, and I was ready to fight for it. It felt like I'd stumbled into someone else's nightmare, only to discover I was the villain in it. The 2 police officers stood in my living room, shifting uncomfortably on the old rug while I tried to explain that I wasn't harassing Victoria Sterling, wasn't threatening her precious development project, wasn't the unhinged crank she'd painted me to be. I told them the truth, that I'd raised safety concerns at public meetings, backed by documented evidence, and had spoken up because I couldn't ignore the risk to families who would one day live in those houses. They listened politely, professional but thorough, their eyes sharp, their notepads ready, taking down every word. I could see it on their faces, the conflict between treating this complaint seriously because it was their job, and the subtle skepticism that came when a man with tired eyes and shaking hands insisted he was trying to protect people, not tear apart a community. After about 30 minutes, they left with a polite but clear warning: keep future interactions civil, stay within appropriate boundaries, and understand that further complaints could result in consequences. The door clicked shut behind them, but the silence they left was like a weight pressing into my chest. That night, I couldn't sleep. I paced the living room in circles, floorboards creaking under my bare feet, replaying every moment that had led me here. My living room, once a quiet refuge where I read gardening books and listened to old jazz, felt like a war room now, every corner filled with boxes of documents, old soil maps, photos of flooded construction pits, and Agnes's notes scrawled in trembling pen. I kept asking myself if I'd made a terrible mistake getting involved in this fight. What if I was wrong? What if Dr. Thorne was wrong? What if the soil was fine, the risk was exaggerated, and all I'd done was set off a chain reaction that would ruin people's dreams of home ownership for no reason. What if I had become exactly what Victoria accused me of being, a troublemaker for the sake of making trouble? Outside, the empty lot where my garden once grew stared back at me through the window, a black rectangle under the moonlight. It wasn't just a patch of dirt. It was where the world had once felt quiet. Now it was the noise. It was the reminder of everything I'd lost and everything I was fighting for, but in that moment, it felt like an accusation, too. Worse than the fear was the isolation. I saw neighbors pulling down their blinds when they saw me walking past. Nobody wanted to get involved. HOA drama wasn't their business, they said, at least not until their houses started cracking and sinking into the ground. Fear of Victoria's retaliation kept them silent, or maybe it was just the easier choice not to care, not to step into the mess. Underscore 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 underscore. The next morning, the doorbell rang. Agnes stood there, small and stooped, holding a rolled-up document that looked like it had been buried in a basement for decades. I remembered something last night, she said, stepping inside and unrolling the fragile paper onto my kitchen table. It was a blueprint, yellowed and brittle, marked with faded lines and annotations. This is the original drainage system layout for this area, she explained, her voice soft. My late husband worked in the city planning department in the 80s. He kept copies of everything. I never thought I'd need this again. She pointed to the lines that curved across the paper, tracing drainage paths that wove through the neighborhood. They designed this whole system based on the natural root networks. They knew the clay soil needed the trees to manage water flow. Without them, water was going to accumulate in places it shouldn't. The trees were part of the engineering. The realization crashed over me. Victoria hadn't just ignored modern warnings, she had disregarded decades-old engineering wisdom, dismissing it in her race to build her empire. Underscore 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 underscore. That afternoon, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. It was Clara Monroe. Her voice, once the calm, scripted tone of the HOA secretary, trembled now, shaking like a branch in the wind. I can't talk about this over the phone, she said, so quietly I had to strain to hear her. But I have something you need to see. Can you meet me at the coffee shop on Maple Street this afternoon? When I entered the coffee shop, I found Clara sitting alone in a corner booth, staring at her phone like she expected it to burst into flames at any moment. She looked smaller away from her desk, younger, stripped of the cold professionalism she wore like armor in the HOA office. Thank you for coming, she said as I slid into the seat across from her. I figured you'd hang up the second you heard my voice. Her hands were shaking as she pulled a small recorder from her purse and placed it between us like a live grenade. She stared at it for a moment before speaking. I hit record last week, she said. It felt wrong, but what she said was worse. She pressed play. Victoria's voice filled the small booth, clear and cold, discussing plans to cut safety costs, dismissing engineering recommendations as fear-mongering nonsense and expenses we don't need if we want this to stay profitable. She talked about me, too, calling me a nuisance, a weed that needs to be pulled before it spreads. I felt cold all over, listening to the way she spoke about me, about the community, about the families who had trusted her. There was no hesitation, no remorse in her voice, only cold calculation. Why are you showing me this? I asked, my voice low, as the recording clicked off. Clara looked down at her hands, picking at her thumbnail until it bled. I have an 8-year-old son, she said finally, tears welling in her eyes. All I could think about was, what if he lived in one of those houses? What if the foundation failed? What if? She swallowed hard. Victoria's untouchable. She thinks she's a queen. She treats people like garbage, like we're just tools. I've been afraid to say anything because I need the job, but after hearing that, I can't stay quiet anymore. I nodded, understanding more than I could say. Underscore 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 underscore. As we talked, Clara told me stories of Victoria's reign behind closed doors. The constant belittling, the impossible demands, the threats whispered between meetings. Clara had tried to ignore it, tried to convince herself it was just how business worked. But hearing Victoria talk about endangering families for profit had broken something in her. She was terrified of what would happen next, but she was ready to stand up. I knew what that meant for both of us. When I left the coffee shop, the recording felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds in my pocket. I walked home slowly, each step heavy, each breath tight. The sky was low and dark, thunder rumbling far away like a promise. Whatever was coming next, I knew it would be a storm. Underscore 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 underscore. The final community meeting was held in the town hall, a larger venue than our small community center, because by now, the conflict had spread beyond our neighborhood. The county knew. The local news had caught wind of it. People were watching. The sky outside was layered with dark clouds, pressing low, heavy with the threat of rain that hadn't fallen yet. It felt like the world was holding its breath. Inside, the air was charged, the murmur of hundreds of conversations blending into a restless hum. Residents clutched paperwork, contracts, and each other's hands, eyes darting around the room, waiting for answers, for truth, for something. Victoria arrived flanked by lawyers and consultants, a corporate siege dressed in designer clothes. Her lipstick was perfect, her hair glossy, her expression unreadable. She moved with the confidence of someone who believed herself untouchable, setting her papers down in front of her with surgical precision. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice strong, unwavering, "I want to address the malicious rumors and false accusations that have been spread about our development project." The room fell silent. "Today, I will prove once and for all that these claims are nothing more than the desperate attempts of troublemakers who wish to obstruct progress and damage the value of our homes." She smiled, but it was the kind of smile that didn't reach her eyes, the kind of smile that warned you she was ready to destroy you if you stepped out of line. Underscore 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 underscore. I stood up, holding the recording in my pocket, feeling its weight, feeling the eyes on me as I moved to the front of the room. My hands trembled, but I lifted the recorder and set it on the table between us. "Before you go any further," I said, my voice shaking, "I think the community deserves to hear this." I pressed play. Victoria's voice spilled into the silent room, every word echoing off the walls. Her plans to cut safety costs, her dismissal of engineer warnings, her cold laughter as she spoke of families who would never know the risks they were living on top of, and finally, her words about me. "A weed that needs to be pulled." Gasps, then silence. Then the room erupted. People shouted, screamed, demanded answers, demanded refunds, demanded safety. Lawyers whispered urgently to Victoria. Her face drained of color, her mouth opening and closing as she struggled to find her words. She looked at me across the chaos, and in her eyes, I saw something that chilled me to the bone. She wasn't beaten. She was planning. It was the way she said it, the precise clip of each syllable that made it clear Victoria Sterling still believed she was untouchable, even as her empire trembled. To take legal action against anyone who continues to spread these lies about my professional competence and integrity. Her voice was calm, cold, practiced. She stood at the front of the town hall as if it were her personal courtroom, chin high, a faint smile flickering like she'd already won, daring anyone to challenge her. She sounded like royalty betrayed, like a queen prepared to burn the entire village if it meant keeping her crown. Even after all we'd revealed, her deliberate dismissal of soil stability warnings, her cuts to safety protocols to save money while hiding risks from residents, she clung to the story that she was the victim of a smear campaign. She threatened countersuits, injunctions, harassment complaints, full-blown legal war, and as her eyes swept the crowd, she let the fear do her work. Her message was clear: sharper than the storm winds rattling the windows, "Stop now, or get buried." And for a moment, just a moment, I felt the hush in the room. People looked at one another, at the ceiling, at their shoes, weighing their mortgages, their children's futures, their savings. Fear can be a powerful leash, and Victoria knew how to hold it tight. But then something shifted. Clara Monroe stood up from her folding chair in the third row, and the air itself seemed to change. The hush deepened, turning from fear to tension as people turned to watch her. Victoria's eyes caught Clara, and for a second, just a second, the Queen's mask cracked. I saw the tiniest flicker of unease, the realization that her control wasn't absolute. Clara didn't rush. She walked slow, steady, like someone who knew she was about to light her last match on a bridge she could never cross again. Her face was pale but set with resolve, the small recording device clutched in her hand. "I request permission to address the community," she said, her voice stronger than I'd ever heard it, ringing clear in the charged silence. Victoria tried to interrupt. "Clara, this is not." Clara ignored her. "I can't stay silent anymore. If I do, I'll never be able to live with myself." She raised the recorder. Every eye fixed on her. The air felt heavy, thick, charged. "This contains a conversation between Miss Sterling and the primary contractor for this project," Clara said. Her voice didn't waver. "It was recorded last week in the HOA office. I'm sharing this because the community has a right to know what your elected representative really thinks about your safety and welfare." Victoria's eyes widened, lips parting to protest, but it was too late. Clara pressed play. And there it was, in Victoria's own clipped, commanding voice, her kingdom collapsing word by word. She spoke of safety codes as costly hindrances, engineers as fear-mongering worrywarts, dismissed soil stability warnings as exaggerations, and outlined how cutting corners was the only way to maintain profitability. She laughed, a sound I'd never forget, as she spoke of families who don't need to know what's under their foundations, if it kept them paying mortgages on time. But the moment that cut through everything was when her voice turned to me. "He's a troublemaker. We need to deal with him permanently before he causes more damage." Her tone was casual, like she was discussing removing a weed from a garden. The room exploded. I saw a man leap to his feet, veins bulging at his neck, shouting that he was calling the district attorney. A mother clutched her baby tighter, tears in her eyes as she screamed that Victoria was putting her family's life at risk for money. Another resident yelled that they were reporting her to the state licensing board. Someone else shouted about lawsuits. Victoria tried to speak over the crowd, but the noise was a rising wave she couldn't control. She screamed that the recording was taken out of context, that it was manipulated, but the confidence had drained from her voice. She looked pale under the harsh fluorescent lights, her perfect hair suddenly too heavy, her papers scattered like feathers in the wind. I saw her eyes, darting around, searching for an ally and finding none. Her empire was cracking piece by piece, and the tool destroying it was her own voice. And then nature itself decided to testify. The storm that had been building all day hit with a violence that rattled the glass windows of the town hall. Rain fell in sheets, pounding the glass like bullets. The lights flickered, and thunder cracked so loudly that people jumped, hands flying to mouths, eyes wide. Through the tall windows, we could all see the development site across the street, Victoria's kingdom of steel and concrete, dirt and promises, being swallowed. Water flooded the half-built roads, pooling in the foundation pits like dark, rising lakes. The makeshift drainage channels Victoria's crews had scraped into the ground were overwhelmed within minutes. Dr. Thorne stood by the windows, pointing with a shaking finger. "This," he said, his voice trembling, "this is what clay does when it's betrayed." He didn't need to finish the sentence. We saw it for ourselves. A model house, half-finished, groaned under the shifting mud, then leaned. It was slow at first, like a tired man collapsing into a chair. Then the front corner dropped, pulling the structure down with it until the entire frame tilted at a sickening angle. I heard gasps, sobs, curses. No one could look away. Heavy equipment, the excavators and cement trucks Victoria had brought in to fix the last flood, began sinking, their wheels spinning uselessly, mud swallowing them inch by inch like a living thing. Victoria Sterling pressed her hands against the glass, shaking her head as if sheer will could hold the ground firm, could force the water to recede. Her lips moved, words only for herself. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, caught between disbelief, rage, and something that looked like despair. Her foundation was gone, not just in the mud but in the room. The fear she used to command had been replaced with outrage, betrayal, righteous fury. Her kingdom of fear was dissolving like paper in rain. I followed protocol, she kept insisting, but no one was listening. The evidence of her arrogance and greed was drowning outside the window, undeniable, unstoppable. Within the hour, the police returned, not to question me about harassment, but to arrest Victoria Sterling for fraud, reckless endangerment, and violations of state building codes. As they cuffed her hands behind her back, she was still protesting, screaming that it was a misunderstanding, that she was the victim, that she would sue them all. The 150-house project was shut down that very night. The land, soaked and broken, sat abandoned for months, the skeletal remains of frames and flooded pits a monument to what happens when arrogance tries to fight nature. Underscore 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 underscore. 6 months later, I stood on that same land, boots sinking into the soft soil, watching green shoots push up through the clay where stumps had once been. I didn't plant those shoots. They came on their own, reminders that the earth remembers, that it can heal itself if given the chance. The county converted the land into a public park, selling it back for a fraction of what Victoria had spent. They put up a small sign at the entrance. Ethan Vance Memorial Park. In honor of those who protect nature and community. The first time I saw it, I cried. Underscore 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 underscore. Clara Monroe left the HOA. She didn't disappear, though. She became an environmental advocate, helping other neighborhoods fight back against dangerous, greedy developments, using her knowledge of how these schemes operate from the inside. Agnes McCall was recognized by the town council, honored quietly as the hero who kept boxes of dusty records that became the ammunition needed to expose the truth. Dr. Thorne didn't retreat into retirement. He started consulting for green development projects, determined to ensure that no neighborhood would endure what we had faced. As for me, I still walk the park, especially when it rains. I watch water flow down channels formed by the roots of the new trees, soaking into soil that can finally breathe again. I watch children playing where heavy trucks once rolled, their laughter echoing over grass that was almost lost to concrete. Underscore 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 underscore. People ask me sometimes if it was worth it. All the fear, the stress, the sleepless nights. They ask if I regret it, if it was worth all that trouble just to save a few trees. I don't bother explaining. I point to the green shoots, to the kids playing, to the way the water flows naturally without flooding. That's the answer. Truth is, standing up for something doesn't feel heroic. It feels messy, isolating, terrifying. It feels like sitting alone in your kitchen, surrounded by old maps and court documents, wondering if you're insane for caring this much. But doing nothing? That's worse. So, no, I don't regret it. Not one bit. And if you've ever had to fight a fight you didn't ask for, just to protect something good from being erased, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. If you made it this far, consider subscribing to QA Stories. We tell stories for people who don't back down, even when the world tells them to stay quiet. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. And remember, nature doesn't seek revenge. It simply enforces its laws, laws we ignore at our own peril. The end.